At North Star Critical Care Hospital in Minneapolis, Nurse Claire Donovan is the joke of the night shift. Small, quiet, always looking at the floor, she is humiliated in front of the entire staff by Dr. Carter Voss, the brilliant chief of trauma, who calls her the nurse nobody asked for. Then a patient arrives that no one can touch. A decorated war hero who has not spoken a single word since the mission that destroyed his team. He breaks monitors, he refuses doctors, he frightens armed security guards. The administration wants to lock him away in a psychiatric facility and forget he ever existed. But when Claire steps into his room, the man who reacts to nothing freezes and stares at her like a man seeing a ghost. The doctors laugh. What could one insignificant little nurse possibly do with a broken Navy SEAL? They do not know that he recognized the hands that once pulled him out of hell. And when his life collapses in front of everyone, it will be his voice, silent for 2 years, that finally reveals who she really is. If this story pulls you in, do 3 small things for the people who tell it. Press the like button, subscribe to Silent Badge's stories, and write in the comments the city you are listening from tonight. Because when this man finally speaks, you will want to be part of the family that heard it first. The snow came down over Minneapolis like the sky was trying to bury the whole city before morning. From the 3rd-floor windows of North Star Critical Care Hospital, the parking lot looked like a field of white graves. Each car a mound, each lamppost a candle burning over it. It was 4 in the morning in the middle of January, the coldest week of the year, and the trauma wing was quiet in the way that hospitals are never really quiet. Monitors beeping behind closed doors, a ventilator sighing at the end of the hall. Somewhere on the floor below, a man crying softly into a phone. Claire Donovan moved through that quiet like she was apologizing for existing. Most of the staff could not have described her if you asked. Small, maybe 5'4" in her worn sneakers. Early 30s. Dirty blonde hair pulled back in a plain, low knot that was always coming loose by the end of a shift. Teal scrubs, at least one size too big. Sleeves pushed up and falling back down, the fabric swallowing whatever shape was underneath. Her shoulders curved forward like she was permanently walking into wind. When people spoke to her, her grey-blue eyes went to the floor before they went to her face. The only details anyone might have remembered were the ones nobody bothered to look at. A thin white scar cutting through her left eyebrow. A scattering of small faded scars across her knuckles, the kind you could mistake for kitchen accidents. A pale line on her right forearm that vanished under her sleeve. She kept her sleeves down. Always. That night she was checking on the man in room 312, a roofer who had come off a ladder onto a fence when his blood pressure started to slide. Not dramatically, just a soft, steady sinking, the kind of thing a tired resident glances at and blames on sleep. Claire did not blame it on sleep. Her eyes moved from the monitor to the man's abdomen, to the color of his lips, to the drain that had gone quiet an hour too early. Hands that trembled when doctors watched them were suddenly not trembling at all. In 4 minutes, she had paged the resident twice, drawn labs, and repositioned the bed. In 9 minutes, the resident finally arrived, annoyed, and in 11 minutes he stopped being annoyed, because the labs came back, and the man was bleeding somewhere he was not supposed to be. They took the roofer to the operating room at 4:51 in the morning. He lived. By 7 a.m., at shift handoff, the story had already been rewritten. The trauma department gathered in the conference room on the 3rd floor. Day shift and night shift crowded together with coffee and dead eyes, and at the head of the table stood Dr. Carter Voss, chief of trauma surgery, 46 years old, and built like the cover of an alumni magazine. Silver at the temples, a tie under his white coat even at 7 in the morning. Voss did not walk into rooms, he arrived in them. Beside him sat Marlene Ashford, the hospital's chief administrative officer, a thin woman with a tablet and a smile that never involved her eyes. When Ashford attended a clinical meeting, it meant money or reputation was in the room. Usually both. Voss praised the resident by name for catching a post-operative bleed on the roofer in 312. The resident, to his credit, turned red and glanced toward the back of the room where Claire stood against the wall between the recycling bin and the coat rack. Voss followed the glance and smiled. Claire felt it coming the way you feel a storm through a window before the glass even rattles. Voss said that he had heard a night nurse paged the resident about the patient. He said it generously, the way a king tosses a coin. Then he asked the room, still smiling, whether anyone had ever noticed how the same quiet people who could barely give a report in the morning always seemed to claim the credit at night. A few people chuckled, the nervous kind. Voss looked directly at Claire for the first time in the 11 months she had worked there and asked her in front of 40 people to remind him of her name. "Donovan," she said. Her voice came out smaller than the room. Voss repeated it like he was tasting something bland. "Donovan." Then he turned to the residents and delivered the line that would follow her down every hallway in that building for weeks. "Every hospital has one," he said. "The nurse nobody asked for. The one who hovers, who pages, who worries out loud, and then stands in the back of the room hoping someone confuses anxiety with talent." He said North Star was a trauma center, not a support group, and if anyone wanted to practice medicine, medical school was accepting applications. The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Marlene Ashford did not laugh. Ashford watched Claire the way an accountant watches a line item, then made a small note on her tablet and moved the meeting along to census numbers and a reminder that a very important transfer might be arriving within days, a case that would have federal attention, and that everyone was expected to be discreet and impressive. Claire stood against the wall with her eyes on the floor, hands folded in front of her, thumb pressing hard into the old scars across her knuckles under the cover of her other hand. Anyone watching would have seen a small woman trying not to cry. Nobody watched long enough to notice that her breathing never changed. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out. Slow and level, like a metronome that had been set a long time ago in a much louder place and had never been turned off. The meeting ended. Chairs scraped. People flowed past her like water around a post, some of them still grinning. Down in the basement corridor by the service elevator, Gus Kowalski was waiting for her with 2 cups of vending machine coffee, one of which he claimed every single night tasted almost like coffee. Gus was 68 years old, a transport orderly with a limp, a Vietnam-era tattoo gone blue-gray on his forearm, and a personnel file full of complaints about his refusal to retire. He had adopted Claire her first week at North Star, the way an old dog adopts the one person at the party who does not try to pet it. He had heard about the meeting before she reached the elevator. Everything in that hospital traveled faster through the orderlies and the janitors than it did through the pages. Gus handed her the coffee and studied her over the rim of his own cup. Then he said that in 1969 he had known a tunnel rat, a kid so small and so quiet that the other soldiers used to make him carry their gear as a joke, right up until the day the ground opened and the joke went down into the dark with a flashlight and a pistol and came back dragging 2 wounded men nobody else could reach. Claire told him softly that she was just a nurse. Gus snorted into his coffee. He said he had been just an orderly for 40 years, and in 40 years he had learned exactly one thing about hospitals. The loudest coat in the building is almost never the person who keeps everybody alive, he said. The person who keeps everybody alive is usually pushing a cart or standing in the back of a meeting, letting fools laugh, because letting fools laugh is cheaper than teaching them. "Sure," he said. And later, when a laughing young resident in the cafeteria repeated Voss's line, the nurse nobody asked for, loud enough for half the room to hear, it was Gus who set down his tray, looked at the kid, and said the sentence that a few people in that cafeteria would remember months later, when the news vans were parked outside in the snow. "You laughed at the quietest person in this hospital. You never asked why she was quiet." The resident laughed at that too. "Old man," somebody muttered. Gus picked his tray back up and let it go. Claire worked 3 more nights that week and said almost nothing to anyone. On the 4th night, a Thursday, the snow returned with a wind behind it, and just after 1 in the morning, the charge nurse's phone rang, and then the unit secretary's phone, and then the overhead system paged security to the ambulance bay, all available personnel. And through the glass at the end of the hall, Claire watched a single ambulance crawl up the white ramp with a state police escort, light bars strobing silently through the falling snow. The transfer paperwork had come in an hour earlier, with more black ink than text. Male, 36, military, behavioral precautions in capital letters. 3 hospitals in 2 states had already refused to keep him. The charge nurse read the top sheet twice and whispered, more to herself than anyone, that God should help whoever got assigned to this one. Claire stood at the window with her cup of terrible coffee and watched the ambulance doors open into the storm, and something old and patient lifted its head inside her chest, quietly, the way it always did right before everything changed. His chart said Chief Petty Officer Daniel Mercer, United States Navy, retired. 36 years old, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor. The rest of his service record was a wall of redactions, whole paragraphs blacked out like the file itself had been wounded. The nurses were not given the chart. The nurses were given a warning. He came off the ambulance strapped to the stretcher at 4 points, and even like that, even sedated and half-frozen, and 2 years deep into whatever had swallowed him, the 2 state troopers walking beside the stretcher kept their distance the way men keep distance from a downed power line. He was big, 6'3" at least, with dark hair gone too long, a beard no facility had managed to trim, and a jagged scar climbing the left side of his neck toward his jaw. His eyes were open. That was somehow the worst part. His eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling tiles, and they did not move for anything. Not the doors, not the cold, not the voices. The transfer summary told the story in the flat, exhausted language of people who had given up. 2 years earlier, Mercer had been the sole survivor of an operation that officially never happened. Since then, not one word. Not to doctors, not to family, not to the Navy chaplain who had reportedly sat with him in silence for 11 straight days. Mutism, the psychiatrist wrote, cause disputed. What was not disputed was the rest of it. A shattered monitor at the VA facility in Milwaukee, a door torn off its hinges in Madison. A male nurse in Chicago with a fractured wrist who had made the mistake of grabbing Mercer's shoulder from behind to guide him toward a scale. North Star had taken him for one reason, and her name was Marlene Ashford. A federal contract for veteran trauma care was worth $11 million a year, and North Star's bid needed a showcase. Ashford stood in the hallway outside room 307 at 2 in the morning in a wool coat over her suit, watching the troopers leave, and told the assembled staff that this patient represented an opportunity, that the Navy and 2 senators' offices would be paying attention, and that for 72 hours, this floor was the most important place in Minnesota. 72 hours, because that was the deadline. If North Star could not demonstrate that Mercer was medically and behaviorally stable, he would be committed by court order to Ridgehaven, a locked state psychiatric facility in the north of the state, the kind of place files go in and people do not come out. Ashford said the word Ridgehaven the way you mention a landfill. A necessary destination for things that cannot be salvaged. Dr. Carter Voss saw the opportunity too. Voss walked into room 307 at 7 the next morning with 2 residents, a portable ultrasound, and the voice he used for television interviews. He introduced himself to the man in the bed as the chief of trauma surgery. He explained warmly that they were all on the same team. 90 seconds later, the portable ultrasound was in pieces against the wall. One resident was hyperventilating in the hallway, and Voss was standing outside the room with a coffee stain down the front of his coat, telling everyone within earshot that the patient was a psychiatric case, not a surgical one, and that his time was too valuable to waste on a man the Navy had already thrown away. By the second day, no one had recorded a single set of vitals. Not blood pressure, not temperature, not so much as a pulse taken by hand. Mercer would not touch food while anyone was in the room. Security had to stand in pairs at the door. A psychiatric consultant recommended chemical restraint for transport, heavy sedation, and signed his note from the hallway because he would not go inside. That night, at the board outside the nurse's station, Voss solved the staffing problem with a joke. He took the marker, wrote Donovan in the box next to room 307, and announced to the assembled night shift that it was the perfect match. "Send the invisible nurse," he said. "Maybe he will not notice her either." The unit clerk laughed. The charge nurse did not, but she did not erase the board either because Ashford was 10 feet away and nobody erased anything in front of Ashford. Claire looked at her name on the board for a long moment. Then she picked up a vitals cart, badged the door, and told security quietly to wait outside. The room was dim and cold, the way he apparently demanded rooms be, and the man they called impossible sat upright against the raised head of the bed like something carved, wrists loose in the padded restraints, eyes on the window and the falling snow beyond it. The muscles of his forearms were rigid. A tray of untouched food sat congealing on the table. The heart monitor he had not yet destroyed showed his rate climbing the instant the door opened. 90, 98, 106. Claire stopped 3 steps inside and did what no one else had done. Nothing. No introduction, no team speech, no hands. Her eyes stayed low, on the floor near the wheels of the bed, and she stood in the way medical people never stand, weight even, hands visible and still at her sides, positioned at an angle to him instead of head-on, leaving the whole path to the door open behind her. The monitor climbed to 112. Held. And then, slowly, it began to come down. Mercer's head turned. It was the first voluntary movement toward another human being that anyone at 3 hospitals had documented, though no one was there to document it, because the observation window was momentarily empty and the only witnesses were the snow and the machines. His eyes, dark and flat as riverbed stones, moved across this small nurse in her oversized teal scrubs, passed over her face without interest, then stopped, on her hands, on the small pale scars across the knuckles. His gaze rose again, slower, and found the thin white line through her left eyebrow, and something happened in his face that no medication had produced in 2 years. It opened. Only for a second, only a fraction, like a door in a bunker cracking to let in one blade of light. His breathing stalled. The monitor stuttered up and then dropped down through 90, down through 80, settling into a low, steady rhythm the psychiatrists in 3 cities would have called impossible. The man who looked at nothing was looking at her, the way you look at a ghost that you prayed to and never expected an answer. Claire met his eyes for exactly 1 second. Something passed across the space between the bed and the door, silent and enormous. Then her gaze went back down to the floor, and her voice came out soft and flat. A stranger's voice, and she asked if it would be all right if she checked his blood pressure. She said she would use his left arm. She said she would tell him everything before she did it, and that if he wanted her to stop, he could lift 1 finger, and she would stop. Silence. The radiator ticking, snow scraping at the glass. Then Chief Petty Officer Daniel Mercer, who had broken a monitor, a door, and a man's wrist, turned his left arm over on the blanket and held it out to her. At the observation window, the charge nurse had returned with a security guard, and both of them stood frozen with their mouths open as the invisible nurse wrapped a blood pressure cuff around the arm of the most dangerous patient in the state, recorded the first vital signs anyone had obtained in 11 weeks, adjusted his pillow, moved his water within reach, and let herself out. Claire wrote her numbers in the chart at the nurse's station without a word: blood pressure, pulse, temperature, respirations. The charge nurse stared at the values, then at her and asked how. "He is tired," Claire said. "Not dangerous, tired. People keep grabbing a drowning man and calling it treatment." She walked away before anyone could ask anything else, and so she did not see the charge nurse pick up the phone, and she did not see, 20 minutes later, Marlene Ashford reading the new vitals off a screen in her office with an expression that was not relief. It was calculation. Ashford scrolled, read the nurse's name, and said it aloud once, quietly, like a woman filing something away. And in the visitor parking lot 4 floors below, a grey sedan sat with its engine running and its lights off, the snow melting on its hood, the same grey sedan Claire had noticed the night before and the night before that. Inside it, a man in a wool cap lowered a long-lens camera, picked up a phone, and told someone on the other end that the file was right. He said the Mercer situation had a complication. He said the complication was a nurse. By the 3rd day, the floor had reorganized itself around a truth nobody said out loud. There was one person at North Star Critical Care Hospital who could enter room 307, and everyone else had learned to hand her things through the door. Claire brought him breakfast at the same minute every morning, because men like him counted minutes even when they had stopped counting everything else. Every action got announced first, in the same low-level voice. Blood pressure now, blanket now, curtain now. She never reached across his body, never stood between him and the door, never let anyone else in while she worked, which security hated and tolerated because the alternative was the thing with the ultrasound machine again. He never spoke. But he watched her now, openly, tracking her the way a man tracks the one fixed point in a spinning room. And on the third morning, when Gus brought the breakfast cart and lingered in the doorway telling a long, terrible joke about a Navy cook, a Marine, and a pallet of frozen chickens in 1971, something moved at the corner of Mercer's mouth. Not a smile, the geological memory of one. Gus limped away down the hall, announcing to the charge nurse that he was a miracle worker and would accept his raise in cash. The charge nurse told him the last raise at North Star had been sighted around the time of the frozen chickens. Their laughter drifted down the corridor, and inside room 307 the monitor stayed low and even, and Claire allowed herself for one unguarded moment to believe the 72 hours might pass quietly. Her body knew better before her mind did. It started with the water. Mercer drank constantly now, cup after cup, and she had been a nurse long enough, and other things longer, to feel the small cold needle of that. Thirst like that had a short list of causes, and none of them were grief. His skin, under the beard, had gone from pale to something grayer. Twice she watched his eyes lose focus when he sat forward, a half-second lag, a pupil's sluggishness. The psych consultant, reading the monitor from the hallway, wrote down as dissociative episodes. On the fourth night, taking his pulse at the wrist because she trusted her fingers more than any machine, Claire counted a rate 10 beats higher than his new baseline, at rest, in a cold room. His blood pressure had drifted down by increments so polite that on any other patient, with any other history, no one would have blinked. And when he shifted against the pillows, his right arm moved every single time to lie across the lower right side of his abdomen. Guarding, the oldest word in trauma. The transfer records from Milwaukee ran to over 900 pages, and Claire read all of them that night at the station between rounds, and found what she was looking for buried in an operative note from 2 years earlier, written in another country by a surgeon working out of a tent. Blast injury, shrapnel, damage control surgery, retained fragments, right lower quadrant, deferred. And then a man stops speaking and starts breaking monitors. And for 2 years, every doctor who meets him reads the first page of his psychiatric file and never turns to page 900. At 6:40 in the morning, she stopped Dr. Carter Voss at the elevators with the printed operative note in her hand and asked for 90 seconds. To his credit, he gave her 40. She laid it out the way she had learned to brief, short, declarative lines, findings first, rising pulse, falling pressure, thirst, pallor, guarding, right lower quadrant. Old retained fragments in the same quadrant. She said the word slowly, so it could not be misheard. Bleeding. She said she believed he was bleeding slowly, somewhere deep, and had been for days, and that if they sedated him for a psychiatric transfer in that condition, the sedation would drop his pressure off a cliff, and he would die strapped to a gurney on Highway 10. Voss looked at the paper without taking it. Then he looked at her and smiled the alumni magazine smile, and asked the hallway in general whether the nurse nobody asked for had diagnosed a surgical abdomen from a psych patient's water intake. Anxiety, he said, raises the pulse. Depression drops the pressure. Broken men drink water and hold their own stomachs because their stomachs are full of everything they will not say. He told her the Mercer case had federal eyes on it, that Ridgehaven's transport was booked for the following evening, and that if she pushed her little theory one desk further, he would have her written up for practicing outside her scope. Then he stepped into the elevator, straightened his coat, and was gone. Claire stood in the hallway holding 900 pages of a man's worst years, and the trembling in her hands stopped, all at once, like a switch going off. The collapse came at 9:12 that night, 14 hours before the scheduled transfer. The monitor in 307 went from a jog to a sprint between 1 minute and the next, and by the time Claire was through the door, Daniel Mercer was grey and soaked and sliding sideways against the restraints, lips the color of dishwater, pressure reading 78/40 and falling. The overhead paged a rapid response, and the room flooded, and everything immediately began to go wrong, because the responders saw a psychiatric flag on the board and a shaking, sweating veteran, and the resident running the code called it a panic attack. He called for lorazepam, He said it twice, loudly, over the noise. Sedate him so we can work. Sedation. Onto a pressure of 78 and dying. What happened in the following 4 minutes entered North Star's permanent mythology, told and retold in break rooms for years, and every version agreed on how it began. The smallest person in the room stepped in front of the medication cart and said one word. No. People who heard it swore the voice did not belong to Claire Donovan. It came from somewhere lower and older, calm and absolutely without appeal, a voice built for rooms louder than this one. No sedation. This is not psych. This is hemorrhagic shock. And then the voice began to move people, by name, faster than they could decide whether she was allowed to. Feet up, head down. 2 large-bore IVs, both arms. Fluids wide open. Type and cross 4 units and activate the massive transfusion protocol now, not after the labs, now. Page trauma surgery, tell them retained shrapnel, right lower quadrant, 2-year-old blast injury, actively bleeding. Gus, warm blankets. Move. The room obeyed. That was the part no one could ever quite explain afterward. Nurses with 20 years on her, a resident technically running the response, a respiratory therapist twice her size, all of them moving on her rhythm, because the rhythm was unmistakable. Somewhere in those minutes her hands were everywhere, sliding a 14 gauge into a collapsing vein on the first try in the moving bed, checking the belly with 4 fingers and reading it like Braille, and they did not shake. Not once, and the people who had laughed in that conference room stood pressing bags of saline and watching those hands, and beginning dimly to understand that they had never once actually looked at her. Mercer's eyes found hers as the pressure came crawling back up over the fluids. He was half-conscious, grey, going under the surgical consent she signed as witness, and he stared at her face with an intensity that silenced the room, his lips moving without sound, shaping something, 1 syllable too, that no one could read. Rest, Claire told him, low. Only for him. I have you. That is an order. The trauma surgeon on call, a blunt woman named Okafor, opened him at 10:03 and found the abdomen full of blood, a slow arterial leak sawed open by a migrated fragment of 2-year-old shrapnel, exactly where the nurse's note said it would be. She closed at 11:40. Coming out to the waiting area still in her cap, Okafor asked who had called hemorrhagic shock on a flagged psych patient and started the protocol before the labs. The charge nurse pointed down the hall. Okafor looked at the small woman in oversized teal scrubs standing alone by the windows, then back at the assembled staff, and said that whoever taught that nurse had not done it in any hospital, and that another 20 minutes of panic attack would have put the patient in the ground. Nobody answered her. Nobody wanted to be the one to explain that the person she was describing had been assigned to the most dangerous patient in the state as a punchline. They wheeled Daniel Mercer past the nurse's station toward the ICU just after midnight, tubed, draped, alive. The whole night shift had gathered along the corridor, the way staff do after a save, and Claire stood at the back of them, already turning away when the gurney stopped rolling. Mercer's right hand had come up off the blanket. Weak, trembling, tethered by an IV line, the hand rose through the air with a purpose that made both transport techs freeze and touched the edge of his eyebrow and held there, flat, steady, unmistakable. A salute, aimed past all of them at the small nurse by the wall. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. It was Gus, standing by the elevator with his cart, who finally said it, quietly, into the silence. And it traveled through that hospital by morning like fire through dry grass. He has not said a word in 2 years. And the first thing he does is salute a nurse. The elevator behind Gus chimed. The doors opened on 4 men in civilian winter jackets that fit like uniforms, short haircuts dusted with snow, eyes that swept the corridor in overlapping arcs before any of them stepped out. The one in front was lean and weathered, with a gray-shot beard and a gaze that went down the hallway, past the doctors, past the gurney, and stopped on Claire Donovan like a rifle finding its zero. And 2 floors up, in a dark office lit by a single desk lamp, Marlene Ashford stood at her window with her phone to her ear, watching the snow come down on the parking lot where a grey sedan had just switched off its lights, and said that, yes, the transfer to Ridgehaven had been disrupted. And yes, she was aware what that put at risk. And then, after listening for a moment, She said the words that would set the rest of it in motion. "We have a problem. The problem is a nurse named Donovan, and by tomorrow night, I will know exactly who she is." The four men from the elevator signed the visitor log at 12:20 in the morning, and the night secretary would later say that watching them write their names felt like watching wolves fill out paperwork. The one who led them printed a single word in the box marked name. Rook. No first name, no last. Under relationship to patient, he wrote family, and something in the way he wrote it made the secretary decide not to ask any follow-up questions for the rest of her natural life. They did not demand anything. That was the strange part, the staff agreed afterward. Four men with military bearing and winter in their beards walked into a critical care unit at midnight and simply arranged themselves around it like furniture that had always been there. One near the elevator, one by the stairwell door, one at the window with a view of the parking lot where a grey sedan had been parked and was no longer, and Rook himself outside the glass wall of the ICU bay where Chief Petty Officer Daniel Mercer lay sedated and breathing, alive because a nurse had refused to let a room full of people be wrong. Rook stood at that glass for a long time with his hands folded in front of him, and his eyes were not on the monitors. His eyes were on Claire Donovan. The official visiting policy died quietly that night, without a funeral. The charge nurse made one attempt to explain the two-visitor rule, got as far as the word policy, and found herself agreeing that rotating shifts at the door would be fine, actually, and could she get anyone coffee? Security made no attempt at all. There are men you card at a door, and men you do not, and every guard in that building sorted the four visitors into the second category on site. Just before 2 in the morning, Rook found Claire at the medication room door. Up close, he was older than his movement suggested, 50 at least, weathered like dock rope, with pale eyes that took in her face, her posture, and both of her hands in a single pass that lasted less than a second and missed nothing. He asked, politely, for the condition of his brother. The report came out of her before she could soften it. Post-operative hour 3. Estimated blood loss before surgery, significant. 4 units transfused, pressure holding without support for the last 90 minutes, urine output adequate, extubation likely by morning, pain managed, restraints removed on her authority, threat to staff assessed as none, and it was never anything else. Short, declarative lines. Findings first, assessment last, no adjectives. Silence followed, the kind of silence a man builds on purpose to see what another person does inside it. Claire did nothing inside it. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out. "You brief like a soldier," Rook said at last. "I read a lot," she said, eyes on the floor, and stepped around him with her cart. And if her heart was moving faster than her face, only she would ever know it, because the monitor was not attached to her. Rook watched the small nurse in the oversized teal scrubs walk away down the corridor, and his head tilted a fraction of a degree, the way it did on the ranges when a round landed somewhere it should not have been possible to land. Elsewhere in the building, on the executive floor, the lamp in Marlene Ashford's office burned until dawn. The man from the grey sedan sat across her desk with his wool cap folded in his lap like a churchgoer and introduced himself as Raymond Kessler, a risk consultant, he said, retained by parties with an interest in the integrity of federal health contracts. His card was heavy paper and said almost nothing. His voice was soft and reasonable and never rose once, and everything about him was designed to be forgotten by anyone who had not spent years learning to remember men exactly like him. Kessler expressed concern. The Mercer situation, he said, had become irregular, a behavioral transfer disrupted, a court timeline broken. And at the center of the irregularity, a night nurse whose personnel file, he said, sliding a folder across the desk, deserved a closer look than North Star had apparently given it. The folder was thin and surgical. Claire Donovan, RN, licensed in Minnesota, 26 months. Before that, a nursing school record from a small program in Ohio. And before that, nothing. An 8-year gap, ages 22 to 30, with no employer, no address history, no tax trail that any normal background check could see. Kessler let the pages speak, then suggested gently, that a facility carrying an $11 million federal bid could not afford staff who might have falsified their pasts. He suggested suspension, pending review. He suggested it the way a man suggests an umbrella to someone already standing in the rain. Ashford read the folder twice. If some part of her noted that a stranger had assembled a dossier on one of her nurses within 36 hours and wondered who paid for that kind of speed, the part of her that could count to 11 million told it to be quiet. At 7:40 the next morning, in front of the day shift, the night shift, 2 residents, and Gus Kowalski with his breakfast cart, Marlene Ashford stopped Claire Donovan at the nurse's station and asked for her badge. The words were administrative: credential discrepancy, routine review, paid leave. The theater was not administrative at all, and everyone present understood the play. The security guard standing behind Ashford would not meet Claire's eyes. The unit clerk who had laughed at the assignment board found something urgent inside a drawer. Claire unclipped the badge and set it on the counter without a word, and the trembling that everyone expected in her hands never came. The hands were still, perfectly, unnaturally still. And Gus Kowalski, watching from behind his cart, felt the hair rise on his arms, because he had seen hands go still like that before, half a century ago, in men about to walk into places other men were running out of. Ashford said the review would take a week, perhaps 2. Down the corridor on the other side of the ICU glass, the monitors above Daniel Mercer began, very quietly, to climb. It took the staff most of that day to understand what they were watching. Extubated by noon, medically stable, the patient in Bay 4 came up out of the sedation into a world with the wrong nurse in it and started to leave that world again in the only direction he had left. He refused the tray. He refused the next tray. His heart rate idled 20 beats above baseline, and his eyes went back to the ceiling tiles and stayed there, flat and fixed, the way they had been in Milwaukee and Madison and Chicago. A day nurse with 15 years of experience approached with meds and got no violence at all, which was somehow worse. He had simply gone entirely to whatever country he lived in when the door of him closed. Rook stood at the glass through all of it, jaw working slowly. At 6:15 that evening, before her suspension had fully processed through a payroll system that moved slower than any bureaucrat, Claire came back up to the floor in street clothes, a visitor now, snow still melting in her hair. Security looked at Rook. Rook looked at security. The door opened. What happened next lasted 4 minutes and became the second story the night shift would tell for years. The visitor in the snow-wet coat did not go inside the bay. House rules. Suspended staff. Instead, Claire stood at the glass where Rook had stood in Mercer's eyeline and lifted one hand and signed something, slow and deliberate. Letters or symbols nobody at the station recognized. The man in the bed turned his head. His right hand rose from the blanket, trailing its lines, and answered. 3 shapes. Slow. Rusted, like a language coming up from the bottom of a lake. Claire signed once more, briefly. Then she pressed her palm flat against the glass for a moment, turned, and walked back toward the elevator with her eyes down, past the entire staff of the unit, none of whom could speak. Behind her, Daniel Mercer looked at the tray beside his bed for a long moment and picked up the spoon. Rook was in the elevator before the doors could close, riding down beside her in silence to the lobby, and only there, in the empty space by the frozen windows, did he speak, and his voice had changed. The politeness was still in it. Something older was under the politeness now. That was not hospital sign language, he said. No, Claire agreed. Rook waited. The snow ticked against the glass. Somewhere behind them, a lobby television murmured about the storm. Where did you serve? Rook asked. Not a question so much as a door held open. Right here, said Claire Donovan, pulling her hood up over the dirty blonde hair. 3rd floor. Nights, mostly. The doors let the winter in and closed behind her, and Rook stood in the lobby of North Star Critical Care Hospital, doing arithmetic he did not like, because there was a story every man in his community had heard secondhand, and none of them could verify, about a night 2 years ago in a valley whose name was still classified, and the story had a shape, and the shape of it was small and quiet, and walked out of buildings exactly like that. Across the street, in the grey sedan with the engine running, Raymond Kessler watched her cross the parking lot and lifted his phone. "The nurse is out," he told the man on the other end. "Suspended this morning. The order goes into their system tomorrow, fully authorized, and the transport is booked for 2100. He listened for a moment, watching the small figure disappear into the snow, and then said the rest of it without any change in his soft, reasonable voice. "Relax," Kessler said. "He will never reach Ridgehaven." The order arrived at 9:03 the next morning through the hospital's own fax line, which should have been the first warning, because no part of the federal government had willingly used a fax machine with that much confidence in a decade. It was, on its face, beautiful. Department of Defense letterhead, a Defense Health Agency routing code, authorization for the immediate transfer of Mercer, Daniel R., Chief Petty Officer, retired, to a secure evaluation facility at Fort Meade, Maryland, for reasons of ongoing operational security, transport to be conducted at 2100 hours by a contracted medical team, all local holds and court timelines superseded. Signed for Rear Admiral T.J. Callahan by direction. Marlene Ashford read it 3 times and felt the entire Mercer problem lift off her shoulders and fly away east. Federal transfer, federal authority, federal responsibility. Whatever happened to the man after 2100 hours would happen on somebody else's letterhead. She authorized the release paperwork before her coffee went cold and told legal to stop asking questions that ended in delays. Rook read the order at 10:30, standing in the ICU corridor, and did not like it. He could not at first have said why. The codes were right. The formatting was right. He stepped into the stairwell and called a number at the Naval Special Warfare Community's headquarters that a retired Master Chief was not strictly supposed to have, and got a duty voicemail because it was Friday, and a blizzard was eating the East Coast, and the entire United States government had gone home early. He left a message. Then he called 2 more numbers and left 2 more. Old instinct told him to put a man on the loading dock anyway, and old instinct was obeyed. Claire read the order at 4:15 in the afternoon, in the basement, because Gus Kowalski had photographed it on the sly with his ancient phone, and summoned her with a text message that said, in its entirety, "Something smells up here and it is not the cafeteria." She stood by the service elevator in her civilian coat, snow melting off her boots, and looked at the picture on the cracked screen for exactly 40 seconds. "The form is wrong," she said quietly. Gus asked what she meant wrong. "The revision date," Claire said. "Bottom left corner." That form was replaced across the entire Defense Health Agency system last spring. A real transfer cut this week would be on the new revision, and Callahan retired in October. A bi-direction signature from a retired admiral's office is not authority. It is a costume. Gus looked at the tiny gray characters in the corner of the photograph, which he had not even noticed were characters, and then at the small woman reading them like scripture, and asked the question half the hospital had been chewing on for a week. "Claire," he said, "who the hell are you?" "A night nurse," she said, handing back the phone, on suspension. "Gus, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to not ask why. Keep the freight elevator on this level at 8:30. Find a reason. Break it, if you have to." Gus Kowalski had spent 1969 and 1970 learning exactly one skill that never left him, which was recognizing the moment when somebody who knew what they were doing had taken charge of a bad night. He said the elevator would be broken by 8. He said it like a private saying, "Yes, Sergeant," and did not entirely understand why, and went off down the corridor with his cart and his limp whistling. The contracted medical transport team arrived at 8:47 in the evening, 13 minutes early, through the ambulance bay. 5 men in navy blue EMS jackets with a private ambulance and a stack of paperwork, and to every person in that hospital except 3. They looked exactly like what they claimed to be. Claire watched them from the visitor chairs near the ER vending machines. A small woman in a grey hooded coat with a paper cup of coffee, invisible in the way she had spent 2 years perfecting and read them the way other people read headlines. 5 men for a single stable patient when private transport ran 2, maybe 3. Jackets crisp and unfaded, patches bright, sewn recently and by the same hand. EMS trousers over boots with side zips, tactical soles, not a scuff of hospital linoleum on any of them. No trauma shears in the belt loops, no stethoscope worn to the shape of a neck. Gloved already, all five, in the warm indoors, hands that had never started an IV hanging loose and ready at their sides the way hands hang when they are used to holding something that is not medical. The team leader signed the intake clipboard with his left hand and scanned the room in overlapping arcs while he did it. Entrances first, cameras second, and under the hem of his crisp blue jacket, printed against the fabric when he turned, rode the unmistakable geometry of a holstered pistol. The gurney was wrong too. Straps rerouted and doubled at the wrists and ankles. A transport monitor with no battery light on. A drug box with the seal already broken. Claire lowered her eyes to her coffee and did the math without moving her lips. A sedated veteran with a psychiatric file, strapped down in a private vehicle in a blizzard, on 200 miles of empty highway with 5 armed men and a drug box. A stopped heart somewhere near St. Cloud. A tragic incident during transport, a body nobody would question, and a voice that had already been silent for 2 years, made permanent. He was not a patient to them. He was a loose end that had learned to breathe again. She left the coffee on the chair and walked, not fast, never fast, to the stairwell where Rook's man on the loading dock had already keyed his radio and found Rook himself coming down. And the conversation that followed took 90 seconds and would have been unintelligible to anyone listening, because it was conducted in the clipped grammar of people for whom meetings were a peacetime luxury. 5, she said, armed, all 5. Fake patches, fake form, drug box open. They plan to do it on the road. Numbers inside, Rook asked. 2 at the desk, 3 staging toward the elevators. Real NCIS is 40 minutes out. Your voicemail worked. A duty agent called the unit desk 5 minutes ago to say, hold everything, and Ashford does not know yet. And when she finds out, she will side with the paperwork, because the paperwork is federal, and I am a suspended nurse. Rook looked at her for 1 heartbeat. Then he lifted his right hand deliberately and asked her something with it. Fingers, angles. A question in a language spoken in the dark by people whose lives depended on silence. A sequence no civilian would recognize as anything but a gesture. Claire's hand answered before her caution could stop it. Fluent. Automatic. 2 shapes and a cutting motion. An entire tactical plan in half a second of moving fingers. Hold them at the desk. I moved the package. Tunnel level. And Rook's weathered face did something it had not done in years, which was open. The same fraction, the same blade of light, as the man in the ICU bed. Copy, said Rook. Master Chief, retired, to a night nurse, and it did not sound strange to either of them. What happened at North Star Critical Care Hospital between 8:55 and 9:40 that night was reconstructed afterward from 14 witness statements, 6 camera angles, and 1 furious administrative memo. And no 2 accounts fully agreed, except on the outline. At 8:55, the freight elevator went out of service with Gus Kowalski standing in front of it, apologizing to everyone at great length about hydraulics. At 8:58, the ICU received a call from the ER desk about a paperwork discrepancy requiring the transport team leader's signature, a call placed by nobody who ever admitted to it, and the leader detached 2 of his men and went down to sort it out. Because his entire plan rested on looking legitimate for 45 more minutes. At 9:01, the patient in Bay 4, who was supposed to be sedated for transport, was instead sitting up while a small woman in a gray coat disconnected his monitor and told him, in a low and level voice, that they were going to take a walk now, and that he would need to trust her one more time. Daniel Mercer looked at her and stood. 2 years of institutional record said this man could not be moved, touched, or led. He rose from the bed like a ship leaving harbor, gray-faced and swaying, 1 fist knotted in the shoulder of her coat. And he walked, hospital socks on cold linoleum, an IV pole rolling alongside like a flag, out through the ICU's back corridor, past 2 nurses who had been quietly asked to see nothing, into the service stairwell, down, guided at every turn by the small woman who never once looked uncertain, who moved through the geography of that building like she had memorized it against exactly this night. Because she had memorized every building she had ever worked in against exactly this night. And behind them, one of Rook's men peeled off to hold the stairwell door, and ahead of them, the underground service tunnel of a hospital built in 1954 ran east under the parking lot, lit every 30 feet, toward the decommissioned wing where nothing had happened since the Reagan administration and nothing could be found without a map. At 9:12, the transport team leader downstairs understood that the paperwork discrepancy did not exist. At 9:14, his two men upstairs found Bay 4 empty and stopped pretending, and one of them put his shoulder through the stairwell door and found a man with a grey-shot beard standing on the landing with his hands loose at his sides, entirely relaxed, asking if he could help them find something. At 9:21, Marlene Ashford arrived on the floor demanding to know why a federally authorized transfer had been sabotaged, threatening police, and was invited by the charge nurse to speak to the actual police, because two state troopers off the highway detail had just walked in behind her, followed at 9:36 by 3 genuine agents of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service with genuine credentials and a genuine interest in why an armed 5-man crew with counterfeit federal paperwork was attempting to remove a protected witness from a civilian hospital. The 5 men were taken with almost no drama at all, which was the final insult to whatever they had been paid. 3 surrendered at the elevators when the troopers arrived. The team leader tried to walk calmly out through the emergency department, badge lanyard swinging, right up until a small woman in a grey coat stepped into his path near the vending machines, looked up at him from a foot below, and said, clearly, pleasantly, and at a volume calibrated to reach every guard in the department, that the gentleman in the blue jacket was carrying a concealed firearm on hospital property. He looked down at her. Something moved behind his eyes. The fast arithmetic of a professional weighing a hostage, a sprint, a shot. Claire held his gaze and did not blink, and whatever he saw in those grey-blue eyes made the arithmetic come out wrong, and he was still recalculating when 400 pounds of hospital security arrived from 3 directions. Only the grey sedan escaped the net. By the time anyone thought to look, too, the space across the street held nothing but exhaust stains and falling snow. But panic is expensive, and Raymond Kessler had spent his allotment of calm that evening because the team leader, now sitting in handcuffs in the ER, had a phone, and the phone had one saved number, and the man on the end of that number had a name that was about to stop protecting him. At 10:50, when the statements began, the senior NCIS agent, a broad woman with a Virginia accent, asked the assembled staff a housekeeping question. She needed the individual who had identified the fraudulent documentation, detected the hostile crew, and initiated protective movement of the witness because that individual's statement would anchor all the others. The corridor went quiet. Doctors, nurses, troopers, administrators, all of them slowly turned toward the small woman standing at the back, by the wall next to an old orderly and his cart, in a coat still dusted with tunnel grime, her eyes already dropping to the floor out of a habit, 2 years deep. And then, past all of them, from the doorway of the room where he was being examined, came a sound that stopped the building. Paper, being torn from a pad. Daniel Mercer stood braced in the doorway in a gown and a blanket, grey, upright, refusing 3 people's arms, and in his hand was a sheet from a nurse's notepad, held out at full reach toward the federal agent, shaking slightly, insistent, until she crossed the corridor and took it and read the single word printed there in block capitals, pressed so hard the pen had gone through the page. The agent looked at the word, then at the small nurse by the wall, then at the word again. Saint, she read aloud, not understanding it yet. It says, Saint. Rook, standing by the elevator, came slowly to his full height, and every person in that corridor watched a retired Master Chief of the United States Navy square his shoulders toward a suspended night nurse in the way men square toward a flag. "Ma'am," said the agent to Claire, into the ringing silence, "I am going to need your full name." The hearing was scheduled for Monday at 9 in the morning, and Marlene Ashford spent the weekend building it like a fortress. On paper, the agenda item read Personnel Review, Donovan, C. But by Sunday night, everyone at North Star from the board down to the basement knew what it was, because Ashford needed it to be what it was. Too much had gone wrong in her building with federal money watching. The counterfeit transfer had been authorized over her signature. The consultant who fed her the dossier had evaporated, along with his heavy paper business card, and the call she made to the number on it rang into static. A woman in her position could survive being deceived only if the record showed her enforcing rules, loudly, immediately, on somebody. And the safest somebody, the only somebody without a title, a lawyer, or a constituency, was a suspended night nurse who had moved a patient without authorization, conspired with visitors to obstruct a transfer, and embarrassed the institution in front of 3 federal agents. Dr. Carter Voss arrived early and sat at Ashford's right hand because Voss could also read weather. The Okafor report was circulating, 4 pages of surgical understatement that made the hemorrhage save sound like what it was, and made his panic attack diagnosis sound like what it was, and reputations, like patients, bleed out quietly unless someone applies pressure. Voss intended to apply it to the nurse. Insubordination, scope of practice, a pattern of unstable, grandiose behavior. He had the phrases lined up like instruments on a tray. They held it in the same 3rd-floor conference room, which no one seemed to notice except Gus Kowalski, who noticed everything, and who had positioned his cart in the corridor outside, with a clear view through the door and no intention of moving for any force on earth. The room was fuller than any personnel review in the hospital's history. 5 board members, legal counsel, Dr. Okafor, uninvited, in surgical scrubs, radiating the specific calm of a woman who has decided she is willing to be fired. The charge nurse, 2 residents who had pressed saline bags on the night of the 9th and had not laughed at anything since. Claire Donovan sat alone on the far side of the table in her civilian clothes, hands folded, eyes down, small, and the performance of smallness was so practiced and so complete that even now, even after everything, half the room looked at her and doubted the stories. Ashford opened with the word regrettable and used it 4 more times in 3 minutes. The narrative assembled itself smoothly. A credential review with legitimate concerns. A suspended employee repeatedly on premises. Unauthorized patient movement endangering a critical case. Interference with what the hospital had every reason at the time to believe was a lawful federal directive. Ashford did not once say the word contract, and it sat under every sentence like groundwater. Voss went next and was crueler, because cruelty was the point of him. He talked about hero fantasies. He talked about small people who inflate themselves inside institutions, night workers who crave the drama of the day. He asked the board, with the alumni magazine's smile, whether North Star wanted trauma care run by protocol and evidence, or by, and here he let the pause do its work, whatever this week's performance had been. Claire said nothing. 4 counts in, 4 counts held, 4 counts out. One of the board members, an older man with a hearing aid, asked if the employee wished to respond to any of it. Claire had opened her mouth to answer when the doors at the back of the conference room swung wide. The wheelchair came first, pushed by Rook, and the room's collective breath caught, because the man in the chair was supposed to be 5 floors away in a bed. Daniel Mercer had been shaved. Someone had cut his hair short again, military short, and found him a plain, dark jacket to wear over the hospital clothes. And the 3 other members of Rook's detail walked behind him in a loose diamond, and the procession came up the center of the room in absolute silence and stopped 10 feet from the board's table. Ashford began to say that this was a closed proceeding. Daniel Mercer put his hands on the arms of the wheelchair and pushed himself up onto his feet. Rook moved to steady him and was warned off with a small motion of one hand. The big man stood swaying, gray-faced, stitched and drained and burning upright, at something that 2 years in institutions had not managed to erase and never would, which was attention. Chin level, shoulders squared toward the board of a civilian hospital as if it were a review of the fleet. He looked at the room slowly. The board, Voss, Ashford, the residents. Then his eyes found the small woman at the table and Chief Petty Officer Daniel Mercer, silent for 740 days, opened his mouth and spoke. Saint. The voice was a ruin, cracked and rusted and barely a voice at all. One syllable dragged up from the bottom of a 2-year lake, and it landed on the room like ordnance. A board member's pen stopped writing. Dr. Okafor put her hand over her mouth. The resident who had once repeated a joke in the cafeteria began silently to cry. Mercer swallowed, hard, and kept going, and every sentence cost him visibly, and he paid. He said that his platoon was betrayed on a mountain whose name he was still not permitted to say. He said the extraction was cancelled twice, weather and threat, and that the men above him made the call men above always make, that 8 were already lost, and no more would be spent on the dead. He said he lay against a rock for a night and a day with his blood freezing into the ground, listening on a dying radio while the world signed him off, and that he was at peace with it, because everyone he loved on that mountain was already gone, and he did not see the argument for being the exception. And then, he said, someone came anyway. Not a platoon, not a helicopter. One person on foot, off the books, up 11 kilometers of hostile rock in the dark, because she had heard the same radio traffic and had refused, flatly, in language he would not repeat to a board of directors, to accept the arithmetic. He said she found him after midnight, already half in the ground. He said the first thing he ever knew about her was her hands, small hands, scarred across the knuckles, cinching a tourniquet with a strength that did not belong to their size, while their owner leaned into his grey face and informed him in a low and level voice that he was not going to die that day, and that it was not a hope or a request. It was an order. The room did not move. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped through the open doors and nobody heard it. He said she carried and dragged and walked him through the dark for 6 hours. He said she talked the entire time, level and quiet, navigation and pressure checks, and once, absurdly, the recipe for her grandmother's pierogi. Anything to keep the thread of his attention out of the dark. And that when his legs failed, she took his weight on her back, all of it, a woman a foot shorter, and kept the pace. He said that when they finally reached the extraction point and the helicopter crew ran to take him, she stepped back out of the rotor light so smoothly that the crew chief's report listed the rescuer as unidentified male. Mercer stopped. His hands had begun to shake and he mastered them. Then he said the last part directly to the board in his ruined voice, at attention. He said that after that night, his voice had gone into the ground on that mountain with his brothers and stayed there. 2 years, 11 doctors, 4 facilities. He said that all of them had wanted something from him. Recovery, closure, testimony, quiet, and that the first person in 700 days who had wanted nothing at all, who had announced every action and left the path to the door open and asked permission to take his blood pressure. The first person whose hands he trusted before he ever saw her face turned out to be the same hands that had cinched that tourniquet in the dark. He had recognized them before he recognized her. He said that this hospital had assigned her to him as a joke. And this morning he said, I am told this room intends to fire her for keeping me alive twice. The silence that followed had weight and temperature. It was the senior NCIS agent, the broad woman with the Virginia accent, who broke it. Rising from a chair at the side of the room where nobody had thought to question her presence. For the record, she said, opening a folder, since the record was what everyone claimed to care about, and read from it in a courtroom monotone. Donovan, Claire Elizabeth, Lieutenant Commander, Nurse Corps, United States Navy, separated at own request. 8 years attached to Special Operations, Surgical and Resuscitation Support, 3 deployments, details classified. Call sign, and here the agent looked up briefly, assigned by the teams themselves, not by any command, Saint. Recommended for the Navy Cross following an unauthorized solo recovery of isolated personnel. Recommendation withdrawn, the agent said, turning the page, at the written request of the nominee, who stated, and I quote her file, that a medal for the worst night of 8 families' lives was a thing she declined to carry. The agent closed the folder. She added conversationally that Warren Tate, a former Defense Intelligence liaison, had been arrested at 6 that morning in Alexandria, Virginia, on the strength of a cooperating transport contractor and a telephone recovered at this hospital, and charged in connection with the betrayal of the operation in question and the attempted murder last Friday of its sole surviving witness, who was now, for the first time in 2 years, medically and verbally able to testify against him. The Navy, she said, considered the events at North Star Critical Care Hospital to constitute the protection of that witness by a private citizen acting with conspicuous competence. The board members were not looking at Ashford anymore. Ashford was looking at the table. Rook stepped forward then, beside the swaying man he had helped carry into a hearing, and addressed the board in the tone of a man explaining tide to people who had built on sand. You have had her for 2 years, Rook said, on nights. Invisible. You should understand what you had. Half the community tells the story of that mountain and argues about whether it is true. Your people wrote her up for worrying too much. He let his pale eyes travel across Voss and rest there, and the room watched Carter Voss age underneath them. She was not the one who needed saving, Rook said. She was the one they sent when no one else could. The vote, when the board remembered it was allowed to vote, took 90 seconds. Reinstatement immediate, with the review expunged. An independent inquiry into the credential dossier, its origins, and every executive decision made in reliance on it, which was a sentence with Marlene Ashford's name folded inside it, and everyone heard it, including Ashford, who was gone from the building by the end of the month. Resignation letter citing new opportunities escorted to her car past a breakfast cart whose operator wished her, with tremendous courtesy, a real nice winter. The board also received that same week the Okafor report into formal record, alongside statements from 2 residents regarding diagnostic conduct on the night of the 9th. The trauma committee met without its chief for the first time in 9 years. There was no dramatic firing. Institutions rarely allow themselves the honesty of one. There was instead a review and a restructuring, and a Dr. Carter Voss who now practiced under supervision he had once assigned, and who one morning that spring stopped Claire Donovan in the hallway, in front of witnesses, with his hand extended and the alumni smile freshly applied, saying that he hoped there were no hard feelings, that he had always suspected there was more to her. Claire looked at the offered hand until it lowered itself. "You never looked at me," she said. "Without heat, the way you state a lab value, you only looked down." Then she stepped around him and went to work, and the hallway went back to pretending it had seen nothing, and it never laughed at him quite the same way it had once laughed at her, which was, in the end, the consequence that reached him. A man like Voss can survive discipline. What he could not survive was the building's changed weather, the residents who now quietly checked his calls against the protocol she had proven, the way a room no longer went silent for him when he arrived in it. The press came, of course. A counterfeit federal crew arrested in a hospital, a silent war hero speaking, a decorated ghost on the night shift. The story was too good, and for a week the vans idled in the snow outside the ambulance bay, and North Star's new interim administrator asked Claire delicately whether she would consider a statement, a profile, a morning show, anything. The Navy asked too, through channels, whether Lieutenant Commander Donovan, separated, would consider a consulting role, curriculum development, tactical medicine, a return in some capacity with a schedule of her choosing. She declined all of it, politely and completely in fewer words than the requests had used, and by February the vans were gone, and the story went the way of stories, and the hospital learned to guard her anonymity the way you guard a load-bearing wall. On the first Saturday in March, when the snow had shrunk to grey ridges along the roads, and the sky over Minneapolis had gone high and pale, a taxi let 2 people out at the gates of Fort Snelling National Cemetery, where the white stones run in lines to the horizon like a formation that will never be dismissed. Daniel Mercer walked with a cane now, slowly, upright. His voice remained a rusted thing that he spent like a poor man, a few words a day, and he chose them. The stones his brothers rested under were not here, scattered instead across the country in 8 hometowns. But the memorial wall by the visitor path carried their operations dead among all the others, and he had asked her, in one of his short sentences, to come with him and hear something. They stood before the wall in the cold, bright morning. The big man and the small woman, and one by one, in his broken voice, Daniel Mercer said the names out loud. 8 names. It took a long time. Some of them had to be attempted twice. Claire stood beside him with her eyes open and let each name go through her like weather, and did not perform her grief, and did not hide it. And somewhere in the middle of the list, her scarred hands stopped being folded and hung simply at her sides, at rest, at last. After the 8th name, Mercer reached into his jacket pocket and took out a strip of ancient nylon and worn metal, cleaned but unmistakable, dark in its creases with what 2 years of care could not remove, and held it out to her. The tourniquet. Her tourniquet from that night, kept through 4 facilities and 700 silent days, the way other men keep letters. "They never blamed you," he said. His longest sentence of the day. He had saved for it. Not one of them. Not for 1 minute. You were the only one doing the math with your own life in it. Claire took the tourniquet from him and turned it over in her small, scarred, steady hands, reading its worn band the way she had once read a form's revision date, the way she read monitors and men. Then she stepped forward and laid it on the ledge beneath the 8 names, flat and square, the way you dress a line, and stepped back beside him, and the two of them stood there a while longer in the pale morning, a man relearning his voice, and a woman finally allowed to put something down. On Monday night she badged in at 6:52, took report, and started her rounds. The floor had changed in ways a visitor would never see. The vitals, she flagged, got answered in minutes now, not hours. Residents drifted to the nurse's station on quiet nights to ask her questions they no longer pretended were casual. Gus had a new joke about frozen chickens that was somehow worse than the old one. In room 312, a new patient, a farmer down from Bemidji with a crushed shoulder, watched the small nurse in the oversized teal scrubs check his lines with impossible gentleness and asked her, conversationally, if she had been doing this long. "A while," said Claire Donovan, and dimmed his light and moved on down the hall with her cart, small and quiet and exactly where she intended to be, past the window where the snow had finally stopped, and if her shoulders no longer curved, and if her eyes no longer went to the floor, the night shift had learned better than to say so out loud. Because the whole hospital understood it now, the thing Gus Kowalski had tried to tell a laughing cafeteria a month too early. She had never been hiding weakness. All along, in the quietest corner of the building, in scrubs a size too big, she had been hiding command. The end. If this story stayed with you, help it find the people who need it. Tap the like button. Subscribe to Silent Badge's stories so you never miss the moment a hidden hero stands up, and tell us in the comments which scene you would want to see with your own eyes, because your words decide which story we tell next.